Good afternoon and welcome to Mount Vernon's Facebook Live. I'm Thomas Reinhart. I'm the Director of Preservation here at Mount Vernon, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this week's Mansion Monday. I was asked to give this Mansion Monday to talk a little bit about what we do in the work of architectural history. So before we start, though, I want to cover a couple of logistical things. First of all, we might have some technical difficulties. It's very windy here today, so we're going to eventually move in under the piazza, so it's a little quieter and you can hear me better. Also, we're outside, so we're keeping our fingers crossed that the Wi-Fi doesn't drop us off, but just stay tuned. We'll get back as soon as we can if that happens. I would also like to take a second to wish you all well and to thank you for coming out. I know you're all hunkered down, just like we are. This is the first time I've been back on the estate in a month, so it's we're all living in a slightly different world. And so I thank you for taking time out of your work day. Maybe you're on your lunch break at home, or maybe you're not working, but you're taking up some hobbies: bookbinding, butterfly collecting, sewing. That's a good one. Making masks for people, right? Good old-fashioned American pursuit sewing. Follow that. Coming here to meet today with you, I want to make sure that you understand that Mount Vernon is closed, but we are still trying to get our content out and to meet our audience in Facebook Lives like this and other presentations, some of our lecture series and the like. Because we are closed, that of course means that we are not taking in any revenue at this point. So I encourage any of you who are able, of course, to think about giving a donation. It helps us carry on these video series and all the events that we're still trying to do virtually. And it does help with some ongoing maintenance work that we are in the process of doing while we're closed. So so we thank you in advance if you're able to do that. So today, let's talk about architectural history. Architectural history falls in the Department of Preservation. I am an architectural historian myself, and we do have a full-time architectural historian, I think, that some of you are familiar with, Caroline Spurry. And what we do with architectural history is what I want to talk a little bit about. Now, architectural history is, as the name suggests, is history. We are historians. And like almost all historians, our primary focus is on documents. We read the Washington letters, we look at visitor accounts to Mount Vernon in the 18th century, and then we also look at documents that have been assembled over the 160 plus years of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And we do that because, of course, people write down what is important. Washington was extremely meticulous in his record keeping, so we are really blessed here, as you probably heard me say in earlier Facebooks that we've done. We have a lot of records from the Washington period, so we have a pretty good idea of when and who and how things went together. But of course, historical documents don't always capture all the details that give you a good, well-rounded picture of what actually happened. There's always gaps. There's always things that need to be filled in. Now, history, of course, is divided into a lot of different subcategories. There's military history, political history, maritime history, women's history, African-American history. Historians focus in their own little niche. And obviously, in architectural history, we focus on buildings and the built environment. So my job as an architectural historian is to ask questions not only of the historical record about the buildings that are here on Mount Vernon, but it's also then to use a whole other set of primary source documents, and that's the buildings themselves. We interact in a very careful way with the buildings because there are clues left behind by the builders, by the people who occupied those buildings, by the people who altered those buildings over the entire lifespan of the structures. We can tease out those clues, and they give us information about these structures, about how they were used, and most importantly, about the people that built them, the people that lived in them, and the people here at Mount Vernon who visited them. We find all sorts of evidence for people's visits to Mount Vernon, visitors like you. So using the documents and using the buildings, we are able to create a fairly good picture of what the history of this built environment at the plantation was. And we also use science to try and pull out some of that information that's just not visible to your eye. So we're going to talk about all three pursuits and how architectural historians use them. But let's maybe take a stroll over and sit under the piazza. So we are looking at the riverfront, the east side of the mansion. Now, we had originally intended to start on the west side, but the wind drove us to shelter over here. So we have some models that we're going to show you over the course of our chat about how the west side changed over time. And we're going to talk about how we understand, how we come to find out about the earlier phases, the earlier iterations of the mansion, from Augustine Washington's time, that's George's father, to Lawrence Washington's time, that's George's brother, to George's early period here in the 1750s, up to what we have today, which is the 1799 mansion. The documents that we have preserved here at Mount Vernon, as I said, there are a lot of them. And they're not just documents that we own in our archive. Because Washington was so famous, even in his own lifetime, on top of the fact that he kept his records so carefully, and he was a very prolific writer of letters. So because he was famous, people kept almost anything that came from him. So we have a fairly robust collection of correspondence that exists in various institutions around the world, including some here at Mount Vernon. We have the business records of running the plantation as an agricultural enterprise. So we have account books that show Washington's personal accounts, shows what he's spending his money on, including payments to tradesmen and craftsmen, people who would have come here to do the work and that got paid. They were more of the specialist line, specialist plasterers, high-end joiners and carpenters. They would have come here, and Washington paid them. So we have records of their payment, whether they were free craftsmen, journeymen that were brought here under contract, or whether they were indentured servants, which Washington sometimes acquired, who were specialists. But of course, he was not paying the majority of folks who did the work here, right? The enslaved labor that kept the mansion going every day. Some of that community were trained craftsmen. They were very skilled, especially carpenters. We have a very robust carpentry record, the carpenter accounts, and it records every day what Washington's enslaved carpenters were doing on the estate, whether they were fixing fences, whether they were doing work on or in the house. So that helps us figure out some of those early activities that were happening during Washington's lifetime as well. As I said, visitor accounts are very helpful to us because people came and they wanted to describe to their friends in letters or even in published accounts to a broader audience what Washington's home life was like. And they were impressed by the mansion. Some people were impressed that it was large and looked like it was made out of stone, even though it wasn't. Some people were impressed that it was maybe a little, we might kindly say organic, but maybe a little ramshackle because it wasn't designed in its 1799 form. It started out as a small house and grew over time. And so some people, there was one very famous English visitor, I don't remember exactly who it was, we could probably get that up online, that once said that Washington probably should have just started over with the house. He was so unimpressed with the architecture of Mount Vernon itself. So we have Washington's words, we have words of visitors, and then of course we have the maintenance records from the early generations of Washingtons that owned the estate in the early 19th century. And then of course we have lots of records about the condition of the buildings when the ladies purchased the estate and opened up as a museum around 1860, and then also the work that they did right around that time. We have information about what they thought was important about these buildings. We have information about who did the work. So we have a really good documented history of these structures. Now, what we do today when we're going to start a project, like any of the projects like that we did. So if you followed us last year, and in fact, a year ago this month, we were having our weekly Facebook Lives for Preservation Month, and we had just kicked off the restoration work that we did on the west front of the mansion. And so every week we would talk about what was going on with the work and the various aspects of the preservation mission. But last year we completed that restoration of the west front. And in order to kick that off, what we did is we did an entire search through every documentary record that we could get our hands on, and then compiled a chronology of all references to the outside siding of the house, this rusticated siding. There was something in the neighborhood of about 610 references from Washington's time all the way up to 2018. And so that's a lot of work to go through those documents. And it's Caroline Spurry and her team are the ones tasked to do that. They're extremely skillful in doing so. It really, as the more projects you work on and the more familiar you get with the record groups, the more skilled you get at getting the information out of these documents. Once we start the work, as we discussed, we're following a plan of what we're going to do. And the first step of that plan is to physically document the building, to know exactly what condition it was in before we do any work on it whatsoever. And that gives us information, kind of gives us a snapshot of what the building looked like, the west front looked like in 2019. And then we're able to, by examining that documentation that we're creating, we can tie it back to repair campaigns that are in those written records from the Mount Vernon Ladies Association or even from Washington's own records, to say that, oh, this windowsill was replaced. Well, we know that this was done in 1932 by Colonel Dodge, and here's the documentation that tells us that. So what we try to do is to know what every single piece of the building that we're working on, we want to know the date of every single piece, because that informs how we're going to treat that. Right? You can imagine that if a windowsill was replaced in 2015, say, and there was a problem with it, we wouldn't necessarily try to go to the same lengths to preserve that 2015 windowsill as we would if it was a 1776 windowsill. That's something that we're going to expend a lot of effort preserving in place and making sure that it's in the best shape possible and that it lasts for generations to come. So we do that initial assessment and analysis of the existing building, tying everything back to the documentation. Once we start to remove the more recent layers of paint, and once we start opening up spaces, and if you recall, following our work in the front parlor, say, where we were conserving all of that 18th century wooden paneling, some of those panels had to come out in order to be conserved, in order to be treated so that they could be returned into a healthy state of a healthy condition. We would then, when we open up those spaces, we're seeing windows into the bones of the house, basically. Places that might not have been seen in 50 years, might not have been seen in 250 years. So we take that opportunity to carefully record everything we see, to carefully analyze every piece of building fabric that we see, whether it's plaster, whether it's wooden lath, whether it's wooden framing members, whether it's painted trim, because we found all those things behind that paneling. And our analysis of those materials then turn us into that third category of scientific investigation of those materials to get more information out of them. But the materials in place, even just the visual assessment of those materials can tell us what kind of tools were used to create those materials. Were they sawn? What kind of saw was used? Was it a rip saw, a one-handed rip saw like a carpenter would use? Or was it a two-handed pit saw that two men have to use to cut large, long timbers out? That tells us, that gives us information about the building process. How big were these timbers when they were initially cut out of the tree? And then how were they altered in order to make the pieces of the house? And then how they were joined together to make the frame of the house. We will look at, we will look for marks of the adze and also axes to see what parts of the wood were actually the initial squaring up out of the tree and what's preserved. And you can actually start to see how larger pieces are cut out of smaller pieces are cut out of larger pieces. And you can actually start to kind of put back together and get an idea of how big the trees were. All of this white oak that they used to build the house, that was harvested right here on the estate in the 18th century. So if we can figure out how big the initial timbers that are cut, that the pieces that were cut out of the tree are, that gives us a rough idea of actually how big the trees were. So there's a lot of initial information that we can get by understanding the building process, understanding the preparations of materials. And that does go hand in hand with our documentary research. We will see that we know that George Washington ran trials to see how good his sawyers were. The sawyers are the people that run that two-handed two-man saw, the pit saw, and he wanted to know how many planks, how many board feet of plank could be sawn by his two-man pit saw crew in an hour or in a day. And he timed them to see how long it took them to do the work. So we're able to then tie back what we're seeing in the house back to that documentary record. And in some cases, therefore, we know who are the enslaved carpenters or sawyers who are doing the work. We know what George was doing. We know what Sambo was doing at the time of these buildings. These additions were being put on the building, and so therefore we can say, if this is pit sawn, this is the crew that was pit sawing. This is the work of these two men. So it really ties a voiceless part of history, the enslaved population, to the work that they did in order to make this house come together in the way it did. But we do, as I said, use scientific analysis to go a step further. Let's take a quick look. If we can put up the paint analysis slide that we have. It's up. So when we do encounter painted surfaces that have survived from the 18th century, we will sample them. And paint analysis takes a sample from the outside of the paint layers all the way down to the substrate, whether it's either on wood or plaster or anything else. And then that gets cast into a clear resin block. It's then polished up to an optical grade and put under a microscope. And what you're seeing on your screen is the layer cake effect, that every layer of paint that got put on from the first time that the exterior siding boards were painted until the most recent surviving layers of paint. So one of the things that we can see very clearly with that is that the paint color of the house changed over time. And this was a big point of discussion last year with our 2019 West Front restoration. White paint in the 18th century isn't as white as white paint is today, because the pigments that they had, white pigment for paint, was white lead. It was an off-white. It creates an off-white paint, whereas the 19th century zinc whites make a brighter white paint, and then titanium white, which was introduced in the 19-teens, makes an extremely bright white paint, and that's the basis of white paints today. So if you go to your paint store and you get you look at the 17 different kinds of whites you can get, they're all pretty much a lot whiter than what George Washington was able to produce, or his painters were able to produce in mixing their paints. So if you look at that slide, you see that at the very bottom, the bottom layers of the layers of paint are either almost an ochre with some yellow mixed in, but then the first layers above, when Washington switches the paint colors from kind of a yellow to a true white in the 18th century sense, he goes from a yellow to an off-white. And as you follow, your eye goes up through those various layers. As you get to the top, and I think in that slide, it even has an arrow that says these are the bright whites that come in. That means that present in those very bright white layers are 19th and 20th century pigments that didn't exist in the time of Washington. So that gives us a hard point in that paint chronology, that paint timeline that tells us what can be Washington and what can't be Washington. And so then by tying back then to those documentary records, we look for evidence written down of every time we know that paint was applied to the surface of that wooden object, in this case, the outside siding of the house. And then we can tie those early layers in. And we're able to say, this layer is 1758, this is from the 1770s, this is from the 1790s, and pinpoint, to the best of our ability, the exact layer of paint. And as you know, Mount Vernon did a lot of paint analysis and made some major paint changes in the 1980s. We talk about that a lot. And when we do work, what we find now is that our ability to see the layers of paint has increased due to improved technology. So the information that we had available to us in the 1980s is different from the level of information and level of detail that we have available to us in 2020. So when people say, well, the front parlor was blue in 1980. Well, why is it now cream? Well, they weren't able to count out. They couldn't see all the layers that we can see today, and they weren't able to tie them in place. So 1980, that was their best state of knowledge to say that it was blue. Today, our best state of knowledge is to say that it was the 5th or 6th cream level in that space. And maybe in time, in 100 years or 50 years, they might be able to see that we were wrong and that there were 7 more layers in there, and that they will be able to pick out a layer that they feel more confident, because they have more information than we do, to say that, no, this one here is the exact layer, right? So that's why we're always going back and reinvestigating, because we're always getting new information. Architectural history is not a static field. There's always new documents being found. There's always new technologies that we can apply to what we do to get further information. And it's not just paint analysis that we use. We analyze our mortar to find what the ratios of sand to lime. Was it limestone? Was the lime coming from limestone? And if you go to Historic Preservation at Mount Vernon's website, Facebook page, we actually, our new mason has been burning lime. He's been during his quarantine, he's been burning lime and making his own lime at home. And we have some photographs of them. So go to the Historic Preservation at Mount Vernon Facebook page, and you can see that post where we have images and actually a video of him making lime. So we're able to look at where that lime's coming from, where the sand is coming from, and how it changed, because sand has different color. It changes the color of the mortar. It changes the color of the paint, the sand paint on the house. So that scientific information is very important to know how the materials were put together. And then another really important scientific practice that we do regularly here is dendrochronology. And dendrochronology is looking at tree rings. We all know trees grow in rings. Every year they put another ring. So if you cut down a tree, you can count back from this year's ring and go back and see how old a tree was. Well, dendrochronologists, tree ring scientists, have created master chronologies where they're overlapping the counts that they've made from different individual trees. And it goes back 500, 600, 700 years for the East Coast of America. So when you cut down a tree, that last year that it was alive is going to be the outside of the tree. And when you make timbers out of it, if we can get that very edge of the tree, which we often get in some of the framing members in the house, we can take core out of it, and we can actually count back the rings. And what we can also do, these scientists can compare our sequence of rings to that 700-year master sequence of white oak, and they can drop our core right into its place in that sequence. So we know what year a tree was cut down, and that tells us what year the work in the house was actually executed. So although we have really good documents that tell us when building projects happened here during George Washington's lifetime, it's always great for us to have that check in place to say, well, we have all this building documentation that this part of the house was built in 1775. We take dendrochronology, we take tree ring samples, and we test them, and we find out that, yes, indeed, the majority of these timbers were cut in 1775. But, for example, on the garden house, the North Garden House that we've been working on, we didn't know when that building was built. We didn't have a record. We had some references that said the new garden houses, but they weren't very specific. How new is new? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? So when we did dendrochronology on those buildings, we found that both of them were, that the timbers had been cut in the winter of 1784 and 1785. But some of the rafters dated to 1786. But we knew from documentary records that the buildings were moved in 1786 to their current locations. So what that discrepancy in the dates tells us is that the buildings were constructed in 1785, but when they were moved, damage occurred, right? They lifted these buildings up and moved them across the estate and dropped them down where they are today. And that not surprisingly, caused some damage to the buildings, and damage enough that roof rafters had to be replaced, because there's only one or two that date to 1786. So it's so that level of information really helps, gives us a cross check between the documentary dates that we get, and that's very helpful for us. It makes a very strong argument for what we know. In the last 10 or 12 years, we've really gotten a handle on the dating of the early phases of the house. And why that's important is because if you were before 2006, say, some scholars would argue that the earliest part of the house, the core of the house, was built by Augustine Washington, George's father, and he was here in the 1730s, 1734, 5, 6, 7, 8, in that range. And then other scholars argued that George's older half-brother Lawrence built the house, and he was here in the 1740s. So there was a camp of people that said it's a 1730s house originally, and a camp that said it was a 1740s house. And even the big historic structures report that did an in-depth investigation into the house wasn't really sure. The physical evidence of the house suggested that gave them inspired them to come up with a kind of unlikely scenario that there was a footprint of the house and that was dug out in the 1730s, but then that the whole house had been taken apart and rebuilt in the 1740s and made just 2 feet bigger. And that didn't really sound like a very likely scenario, especially given the way that the frame worked. And so when we did Dendrochronology in 2006, we got some very interesting results. And the results that we got were that the center part of the house all dated to 1734. From the front to the back, from end to end, the entire thing dated to 1734, which was a conclusive argument that the house was built for Augustine Washington and his family, and they moved here shortly after the house was constructed and stayed here for about 4 to 5 years. The other evidence that we got was we confirmed that the construction sequence in phase 2 of the house in 1758. So I'm going to ask if we can put the phase 1 image of the house. We did a model a few years back of the early house. And this would be, is it up on screen now? All right, so this is looking at the west side of the house, the land side of the house. It's looking at the house as it would have looked, our best guess of what it would have looked like in 1734. And one of the key contributions that we have made in the current years that since I've been here is that we have figured out that we think that the door, which is off center, and it's always a big question people have, is why is that west door not in the middle of the house? Why is it off center? Well, the door is off center because that big 1758 stair rises up and the door has to get pushed to one side of the central passage. But what we've been able to figure out is that the evidence appears to support the notion that the stair was always there, so that the 1734 stair is roughly in the same location as the current stair, the 1758 stair. So that would indicate that the door was in the same location in 1734. So that means that the house always had an off-center door since it was built in the 1730s. Now, I know when we think about 18th century architecture, one of the watchwords is that these buildings were made to be symmetrical. They loved symmetry in Georgian architecture. And that's true. They really did strive to have symmetry. But the thing is, there's two things at work. First of all, that's an overemphasized characteristic. There are lots of 18th century houses that are asymmetrical. A lot of them. It was not the end all and be all. For big important structures, sure. And sometimes you see odd lengths being gone to, like putting a stair across a window because you have to have that window right there to have balance in the outside facade. You see that all the time. But it is not an end-all and be-all to make a house symmetrical. So, but the second point, which a lot of people don't get, is that in the 1730s, when the house is constructed, the front of the house is this side, the piazza side, the river side. There is not a good system of roads for people to come and visit Augustine Washington and his family. They're coming on the Potomac River and coming this way. So this east side is the front of the house. So that west side wasn't as important to get symmetry. There was symmetry on the east side of the house in the 1730s, as far as we can figure out. But on the west side, you just don't have that symmetry. In fact, the windows to the right of the, after we did this model, and it shows you how things change all the time. This model was done, I think, 2017 or 2018. In 2019, as a result of our work on the west front, one of the things we discovered is that the two windows into the dining room are not original to the house. They actually get put in, they get moved. And it looks like there was only one window there. So that model you're looking at, which is only 3 years old, it's going on 3 years old, is already out of date because the work we did in 2019 changed our understanding of where the windows were in the early period of the house. So now we've got to update that model. So some of the changes that we wanted to put into that model, we wanted to emphasize is that the classical elements that you see on the house, like this nice door surround or the door on the west front, which we'll see in just a second when we go to the 1758 model. That classicism, those classical elements were really not very widely seen in America until a little bit after the 1730s. You start to sort of see it more toward the middle of the century. That's why George, in his 1758 work, is putting these classical elements in the house because that's what's fashionable at that time. But in the 1730s, that door that you see in that model, that very plain door with just a transom light window above it, that's a much more 1730s Virginia arrangement than you would have seen than this classical door. Likewise, if you look at the chimneys, you see white bands around the chimneys. That's a very classic 1730s plaster necking around the chimneys. They didn't survive. Those chimneys disappeared during the later work. Those bands disappeared. We don't know for sure whether they would have been there, but surviving houses from that period, very many of them have that feature. So we incorporated it into our model to show that the house, the little details of the house, the fashionable details, were there in the 1730s. And that they eventually get updated in every subsequent remodeling that George and Martha do in the later part of the 18th century. So can we go to the second phase of the house? In 1758, we see that George raised the roof. We all talk about that all the time. But he did, you see, put that classical surround that survives on the exterior of the house. We think that dates back to the 1758 period as well. Notice also that where there was just plain siding in that 1734 model, I meant to mention, now you see that the rusticated siding has appeared, right? It's that classicizing style and architecture coming in. And we know for a fact that George used that rusticated siding to make it look like stone blocks. He starts doing that in the 1758 period. So that's another change that we believe happened between the 34 house and the 58 house. But you're missing some major things. Like there's no big pediment that with the ox-eye window, with that oval window in it yet. That comes in the later periods of the 1770s. I've been able to identify changes that were made inside the house that happened before the 1750s work, which are interesting, and they seem to date to the time of Lawrence Washington. And we were unable, prior to this, there wasn't a lot of evidence that Lawrence Washington had done a lot to the house. But what we know of his character, that he was very much a societal climber. He marries into the Fairfax family. He really seems to want to work his way up in Virginia society. We think that he put the paneling in the downstairs bedchamber. We think that he perhaps created the central passage in the 1740s. And that would have been a very fashionable change to a slightly out of date house plan that was in place in the 1734 house. So when we get to what we see today in the 1799 house, if we can go to that next slide, the full-blown house as we see it today, it expands, it doubles in size by adding that study wing on the south side, on the right-hand side of that west end, and then adding the new room wing to the north side of that west side as well, the north end of the house. And those changes allow some more classical elements to come in. So the Palladian window on the north end. George also has the big pediment put on. He puts the cupola on, which is a really monumental feature for a house. Now, there were a lot of houses that had cupolas like that. Later in the 19th century, you see it a lot, but they sort of point back to our cupola, which was really sort of a fashion-forward choice by the Washingtons. So we see we've been able to dendrodate and confirm that the south wing was done in 1774. It was framed. That the new room wing was framed in 1776. That the pediment and the cupola were both done in 1778. There's actually they have to beef up the framing of the roof. They have to put rafters that are double in size in order to support the weight of the cupola in 1778. And we have a dendrodate from those big rafters that were put in. So all of this comes together. The documentary evidence, the physical evidence, and the scientific evidence all come together to refine our understanding of the growth and evolution of this place. So I think that we're probably ready to have some questions. If you folks have questions, please type them in. We may already have a running list of questions.
Yep. So, Tom, we have a question for Cynthia. To what extent was George Washington constrained or emboldened by the original structure when he started modifying the estate?
That's a great question, Cynthia. And it was in what ways was George either sort of limited in when he started making additions to the house, or in what ways was he emboldened? Well, I think certainly we would all agree that he was emboldened to take risks, right? That's sort of his character in his military life, and certainly here at Mount Vernon was his character as well. He took some pretty big risks fashion-wise by putting on the pediment, by putting on the cupola. He took a risk in doubling in 1758 by putting the second story on a house that he didn't even own yet. It was still owned by his sister-in-law, but yet he makes this huge investment of money into a house that he doesn't own. So that's pretty bold, right? Now, how he was constrained. One of the interesting things that we discovered in our work in the front parlor and on the west front was that the 1734 house had a lot of structural issues that were identified and corrected in the 1758 work. In fact, it looks like the front wall of the house actually leaned in quite significantly at that time. And Washington's carpenters kind of thickened the front wall up and straightened it up by what we call sistering, pairing another set of timbers with the existing timbers to plumb up or straighten up the front wall of the house. Some of the things that we see, we think, why didn't you just tear it down, or at least some parts of the wall, tear it down and rebuild it? But they didn't. They kept the structure and they altered it and repaired it. So that definitely constrained them. Behind the paneling in the front parlor, there's a chair rail still in place on the south wall, the wall along the central passage. And that chair rail goes like this. It's bent. It's like an arc because the house had sagged and settled so much in the first 20 years of its existence. And that's why the front parlor ends up getting the wooden paneling that it had. Prior to that, it had a really high-end, really nice, expensive plaster paneling. But all that plaster paneling had cracked and because of the settling of the house. And so what they do is they basically build a slightly smaller room with the paneling inside the bigger original room and square it all up so that all the wooden paneling from 1758 is nice and plumb and true and square and looks great. But behind it, there's plaster paneling that was probably falling apart in 1758, and probably inspired the redo of that front parlor. So constraints are that he really was working within the footprint of a house that was maybe not of the best quality in its bones, because it had really sagged a lot in that first 20 years. I think some of the problem is that the rooms were big and they undersized some of the floor framing, and so you start to see ceiling sagging from the second floor. There's all sorts of structural issues that then we see repairs to. I'll say one funny thing is that our carpenter Dave Weir, when he saw that when the sagging of the second floor joist meant that when they did the front parlor ceiling, they wanted to make it level. So how they fixed that, because the framing was sagging, they sent the carpenters in to basically like cut them level in place, and that meant adzing above their heads, which is really hellish work. And Dave always says, I think George just hated his carpenters. I mean, to make them do that work, right? And it was part of the constraint. It was part of the only way that they could get the house to perform and look as they wanted, as the Washingtons wanted it to look. And it was hard work. It was hard work for the hired carpenters, and it was certainly very hard work for the enslaved carpenters. And they did an amazing job. The house is still standing in great shape, and it still looks good. Another question?
So yeah, Tom, a question from Dave. Every time the roof was raised or expanded, wouldn't the house have been empty to deal with and how did they deal with exposure elements with a lack of covering?
Dave, that's a great question. There is, in the letters that are associated with the raising of the roof in 1758, there's a great series of letters from the overseer of the project, Patterson, and he's writing to Washington. And what he makes very clear that what they did. So we see what they did. The top of the wall of the 1734 house was left in place. Those walls were left in place. Then they kept the second floor joists in place from 1734. They dropped another wall plate on top of it. So they put two horizontal members together, and then they built the framing of the second story wall on top of those paired plates. And what they did is they built the walls, the exterior walls first. They framed the roof at the very tall roof, the two-story roof. And then while they were doing all that work, they left the 1734 roof intact. And it wasn't until they roofed the 1758 second story that they then disassembled the 34 roof basically inside the house. So that's how they kept the first floor from getting flooded by rain and any of the finishes getting damaged. That is having those letters is extremely helpful to us, and really interesting to see how the building process unfolded in the 18th century, right? Like, they don't have cranes, they don't have pneumatic lifts, they're doing all of this work by hand. These carpenters, were the inheritors of generations of knowledge passed down from carpenters in England, coming across the Atlantic, and carpenters that had been working here for 100 years, or 150 years almost, by the time we got to 1758.
And Tom, a question from Michelle. What would be the architectural style for Mount Vernon? Federal, colonial, pre-colonial, classical style, Grecian?
Okay. What it would have been called in the 18th century is probably, it would have been called Palladian, or in England in the late 17th and earliest 18th century. There were a series of architects, like Inigo Jones is a very famous one. William Chambers is the father of English Neo-Palladianism, as we call him today. But these were guys that were taking Renaissance architecture and bringing it to England hundreds of years after people like Palladio. Palladio wrote a treatise in Italy in the 16th century about classical architecture. The English Palladianism is taking this Italian Palladianism, which is a 16th century reworking of Roman architecture. big temples and the big public buildings that survived in Rome into the Renaissance. So Palladio takes it, then Jones and Chambers and their contemporaries, they take it and they put their own English spin on it. But what they're basically doing is replicating the proportions and the detailing of Roman architecture at the time. So Mount Vernon is considered a Palladian house because it is incorporating all of these classical elements, like the Palladian window, the big pediment. Also, the very fact that it's a 5-part house. We got the big mansion itself. We've got the colonnades. Those are another part. And then we have the flankers, the servants' hall on one side, the kitchen on the other. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parts. That's the sort of the perfect Palladian house, is to have a big 5-part house like that. So that's how they would have thought about it in the 18th century. Now, as I mentioned, an Englishman coming over and looking at Mount Vernon might not think it was particularly Palladian or particularly graceful in its execution, but it was what we have. And it is what Washington chose to have constructed. Today, we would certainly say that it's not strictly colonial, because that is not an architectural style more than it's a time period, right? When we were colonies, America was colonial. After the Revolution, we were our own nation, so we're no longer colonial. But we do see that while the overall structure is Palladian or Georgian, as it is sometimes called in architecture, we see the elements of wanting to get balance and symmetry in the overall design of the house, very much so on the east front, a little less so on the west front. But we also see that in the house itself, the highest, the most fashionable finishes are used. And we can kind of walk through the house, the front parlor and the central passage. They are very fashionable for the 1760s when they were finished. The downstairs bedroom is very fashionable to probably the 1740s, which was Lawrence's time period. The dining room was done in 1775, and its finish is extremely fashionable and was done by an extremely talented plasterer and an extremely talented joiner and woodworker, and that really fits its time. As does the study, a good 1770s room. But the new room itself, if you follow Mount Vernon, you know that the new room is far more fashion forward than any other part of the house. When it is completed, its interior is completed in the 1780s. Washington chooses to use the neoclassical style, which really was still current and still very, very fashionable in England, and hadn't really hit in America. There's only a handful of buildings that even can vie with Mount Vernon as to be considered the first neoclassical interior in America. And we've got a really good one here. It's something which is often overlooked. People always associate Thomas Jefferson with the neoclassical, and not a lot of people associate George Washington with it, because our new room was just that. It's a room. It's not a whole building like Monticello, but it really was cutting edge architecture at the time it was completed in 1788. That's a great question, Michelle. Thank you.
And a question from Derek. Is there any indication that George Washington relied on an architect or who came up with the design changes?
Well, there is no evidence that George Washington ever relied on an architect for work here at Mount Vernon. There weren't a lot of architects, what we might be considered true professional architects practicing in America in the 18th century. How buildings were designed was generally by a builder laying out what the house was going to be based on the received knowledge and the current fashions. And received knowledge, I mean that, that a beam this big can only span this long, so therefore, it has to be supported with a wall at, say 20 feet, and that's as big as your house can be, or that's as big as a room can be. So you're limited by the materials, and you're limited by the received knowledge, the practice of construction that the carpenter, the builder that you hired to build your building, has in his in his mind, in his toolbox, right? But when you get to finishes, then you have a really interesting thing happening. With all this Neo-Palladianism, a lot of these ideas, a lot of these designs in England are being put into books, architectural pattern books, and they're being sent over to America, and they're available in America. So a really savvy builder will own these books or will collect images and create his own scrapbook. There's a great scrapbook in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that a plasterer put together in the 18th century, where clearly he's cutting out, it's like a scrapbook, and he's cutting out designs and his own from other sources, and he's putting his own designs together. And these books would then be brought and shown to the owner of the house, the person who's hiring you, and they'd say, oh, well, I want a window that looks like this. I want a Palladian window. That's what Washington did on the north end of the house. Or I want this fireplace surround. And there's a number of places in Mount Vernon. You can go to our architectural, one of our architecture pages has the source material for a lot of the interiors, some of the chimney pieces, the door surrounds, the Palladian window, all of these things can be cited back to various sources, most heavily Batty Langley, who's an English architect who was working in the early 18th century. And we can say, this is where the craftsperson that made this mantelpiece, this is where they got the idea. So there's that. But what's also interesting about Mount Vernon is that what we have from about 1773 or 74 is a lovely little sketch that George Washington did of the west front of the mansion. And it shows, now it's not, the mansion hasn't been expanded yet. There's no cupola, there's no pediment, there's no new room, there's no study wing. It's just the 1758 house at this time. And George draws up his vision of what he wants the house to look like. And it has a cupola, it has a pediment, and it has these two wings on it. So that, the final form that we see today was the brainchild of George Washington. It was his design. He drew it out and probably handed it over to his builder and said, this is what I want, make this happen. And the builder made it happen by referencing architectural details in these pattern books, by applying the standard construction techniques and materials of the day, and he made what Washington wanted. So it is, as I said, I know when we talk about early presidents and the founding fathers, Jefferson gets all the kudos for architecture, and he was a very talented architect, but Washington was very active architecturally. And what's nice is that Mount Vernon represents his architectural world surviving, right? He built houses in Washington, D.C. He had spec houses built, and they don't survive. His house in Alexandria doesn't survive. What survives is the house that he put his heart and soul into, which was this mansion.
And a question from Lily, was there any additions to the house made after Washington's death?
Yes, Lily, that's a great question. There were changes made to the house after Washington's death. The immediate heir to the house after Martha dies in 1802 was Bushrod Washington. And Bushrod adds, we believe, around 1818, 1820, based on depictions of the house in this period. He builds, he puts a railing on the top of the piazza roof that was there until the 1930s, when it was taken off, when they were trying to restore the house back to what it looked like during Washington's day. He also built a porch on the end of the mansion, on the south end, a big 2-story porch. So he cut the windows in the Washington bedroom into doors, and he cut the windows in the study into doors. And there was this 2-level porch that you could go out on the first floor, go out on the second floor. That gets rebuilt, we believe, in the 1840s by John Augustine Washington III, or his mother, Jane Washington. And that stays on the house again until the 1930s, when it's taken off and the south end is restored. Now, inside the house, though, there were not a lot of changes. One significant change, which is actually kind of helpful for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, is that when you take our tour and you come upstairs and you go into you're up at the top of the stairs where we talk about the bedrooms, and then you go through the yellow room, and then you pass through a doorway into the back hall at the Washington's bedroom. That doorway that you pass through from the yellow room into the back hall, that wasn't there during the Washington's lifetime. That was put in by John Augustine Washington and his wife, because they used that room. They were sleeping in the Washington bedroom, and they used the yellow room as a nursery, and they wanted to have access to their children. So that door was never reversed. It was never put back to the George and Martha Washington time period of not having a door there, because that allows our visitors to get through from one part of the house to a completely secluded part of the house in the Washington's lifetime, which was their private apartment on the second floor. So that got left so that we could, when you come and visit, you can make it from one side of the house to the other without having to go back down the stairs and outside.
And a question from Cynthia: when George Washington was sending ideas to Mount Vernon for modification while away at war, did he send more ideas, more or less ideas as a quantitative sense, or was he also specific dimensions, instructions, plans, etc.?
Well, he didn't get involved in that we have surviving in any documentation, things like the dimensions and the like. What he did do is demand that he get what we call bills of scantling, meaning when you've cut all the timbers, you want to know how many sills you have, how many corner posts you have, how many wall studs, how many floor joists. So he made sure that his carpenters compiled all that information and gave it to him, so he knew that he had enough stock. They had enough stockpile to do the work. What he did, because you're correct, in 1758, when the house is getting raised to the full second story, they're asking him questions. The Patterson is sending letters to Washington. His friend Brian Fairfax, who is visiting here, he's writing questions to Washington, and he's having conversations with Patterson, and there's kind of this three-way letter exchange going on. And they're saying things like, well, what do you want us to do with the floors on the second floor? And, here's what we can do for you. We can either do them all new, or we can refurbish them and they'll look great. And they were expecting responses for him, and they would get responses. And he was concerned about the floors. He thought that the floors in the central passage on the first floor were in bad shape, and he wanted those replaced. We think they were replaced. They don't survive to us. They got replaced again in the early 20th century. And we don't know what they looked like, but presumably they got replaced in the 1750s. But so he's on one level, he's a detail-oriented guy, right? He's really into management of information and giving his opinion on the work that he's paying for, right? So he's definitely getting into the weeds, but he's not getting into the weeds so much that he's saying, well, I want the corner posts 8 by 10 inches, right? He's not getting down to that level of detail. He's leaving that to these skilled craftsmen who both enslaved and free. He's leaving it to them to make those calls because they're the ones qualified to do so.
So, Tom, probably time for about 2 more questions.
Okay.
And so the first one from Kimberly: what happens during a typical day for you?
Well, right now I get up and I go downstairs and make coffee, and then I get on the computer while I'm still wearing my pajamas and start answering emails. So a typical day for me now is probably far more meetings than I ever want to have. But I review a lot of the work that gets done by the preservation team. So that's the archaeology team. They're planning for some work to be done on the estate. They're doing research. I'm checking over that, making sure that the plan fits our mission, that we all agree on what the questions are to be asked, and that all the research has been all the sources of documents have been consulted, and that we have a really good idea of what we want to do and how we're going to do it. For architecture, it's the same thing. I work with the architectural historian, Caroline, and her team. She's doing all that background research in our archive and in the letters. She and I are discussing how we're going to frame the work that we're going to do, and how, what the questions that the research that we are doing are, what the questions are to be answered. And then also with our conservation team under Steve Stuckey and all our carpenters and our mason, I'm reviewing the proposed work. Does it meet preservation standards? Is it an approach that we want to use? If there are new approaches that we want to try, are we trying them in a responsible way? I mean, and much like George Washington, I don't have that much to worry about because I have really great people working for me. So, I do review it because that's my job, and I like George, I want to make sure that I'm getting my 2 cents in the work that's being done in the programs that I oversee. But I have really great archaeologists, architectural historians, conservators, carpenters. I got a great team working here, and I don't really have much to worry about. So I can enjoy my cup of coffee in the morning and not have to worry what's going on.
And Tom, last question: what's your favorite document of all time and your favorite architectural oh wow?
My favorite document of all time. That's a tough one. I'm going to go to my architectural oh wow first. the my favorite oh wow of Mount Vernon, and I hope that we'll get to this. And I'm looking at the man holding the camera, Matt Briney. I want to do a series, so start writing in, asking for it, email them. Secret Spaces of Mount Vernon, where I take you guys into these really great spaces where that the public doesn't get to see, but that there's really cool stuff to be seen. So one of my favorite spaces is above the new room. So the new room is 1 3/4 stories tall, but the whole addition is 2 stories tall. So there's a gap of about 3.5 to 4 feet between the new room ceiling and the 3rd floor, the garret floor, and it is really cool. We've got 1758 siding boards preserved in there. We've got graffiti. We've got graffiti that we think were probably done by the carpenters that built the space. It is awesome. You can see the back of the false windows on that addition. Another really great oh wow space is the space behind the book press in the study, which got closed off in the 1780s, but it dates to the 1770s. So there's a coat of paint that's been on the walls since the 1770s, never touched. It's awesome. But the oh wow stuff, I think I do really sort of think my favorite document is that one. It's not even a George Washington document. It's the guy that sort of makes the comment, the crack about how George should have really just torn Mount Vernon down and started again. And I like it because, it's sort of a, oh yeah, buddy, well, it's still standing. Where's your house, right? Mr. Englishman, where's your house? Is it still standing in England? Well, ours is still standing. It's in great shape and people love it. And we have great people taking care of it. And so there, you didn't have to like it, but it is famous worldwide and your house isn't. So that's probably one of my favorite documents. So all right, so I'm given the hook now from Matt. It's really been great visiting with you, and again I will say that we hope you're all well and healthy from the Mount Vernon staff, and that you're surviving this really unusual time. And I will ask again and remind you that we're at a critical time too, as an institution. Without visitors coming in to support our mission financially, we, like a lot of institutions, are facing some hard times. So if you can spare support for Mount Vernon financially, I would ask you to do so. We know how much you guys care about our mission, and we really do appreciate the feedback we get from you, and we appreciate the financial support that you give us. So thanks for spending this afternoon with me. Don't forget that we're to check our website. There's a lot more programming that's coming up. Have a great day and stay safe.